Hello, people. Welcome. We're trickling in. As you guys trickle in, before I start doing the intros, I'm going to add a poll question because we're curious. And that poll question is, hey, why are you here? What's up? Are you here for education? Are you here for project research? You have an upcoming project. You don't know where you are. Well, you're here for a Prevalent third-party risk webinar. I'll tell you that right now. And you're a Prevalent customer, which is great. So I'm going to add that in there. I'm going to leave it up while I start doing intros. Hey, everyone. I'm Amanda. I will be your host and we'll be joining in and out throughout the session for questions. We're going to keep this interactive. So please put your questions in the Q&A below and we will ask on the fly. We won't wait till the end. So you guys are kept on your toes here. And today we are talking about third-party risk management, as you can see here, and 5 things you need for a successful third-party incident response plan. And we have with us Jefferson Pike, Director, Information Security and Third-Party Risk Management at Lowe's. Hey, how are you, Jefferson?
Hey, good afternoon.
Good afternoon to you. Good morning to me and Brenda. We have Brenda here, our very own VP of third-party risk here at Prevalent. And today they are going to show us how to create a plan for major security incidents and data breaches and accelerate your response for your third parties before the next big one happens. And we know it is a matter of when, not if. So they will take care of you guys. Please, again, make sure that you are participating. We love participation. You'll get an A for effort. I will end this poll in just a second. It will be recorded and you guys will get it in your inbox tomorrow. And if you have any questions, again, use the Q&A. And thanks so much for joining us. I'll give it over to Brenda.
All right, thanks, Amanda.
You're welcome.
So normally in our webinars, in the past couple of webinars, we've had questions that we've posed out to you as polling questions throughout the whole thing, but we don't have that this time because I want to give Jefferson enough opportunity to just freely discuss, like a fireside chat, how his organization implemented an incident response plan in order to address all of the different things that we're facing. So if we look at the last or the most recent 3 breaches, they're multiplying and they're coming at us at a very rapid pace, and they're not small. They're big and they're impactful. So SolarWinds, for example, had 18,000 companies and government organizations that were impacted. Excellium was 100 plus high profile customers that got impacted. And then Microsoft Exchange was the most recent one that we've been dealing with. And that was 125,000 servers worldwide. So what's going on with that is there's a lot of vendors and suppliers and outsourcers that use these types of products and or services. And what happens is the board of your own company, and even at Lowe's or any other company, has basically understated that, okay, hey, we need to know what's going on. Who are our vendors that got impacted? How are we going to mitigate it? Did we stop the bleeding? What plans are in place? Yada, yada. There's so much to understand. And sometimes you don't always know the entire vendor universe. So we're going to be talking to Jefferson about things that he put in place specifically when the SolarWinds started. So he had already started thinking about, I need an incident response plan within my TPRM program that addresses third-party incidents. And I believe that when SolarWinds happened, Jefferson, it was something that immediately you turned around and you were able to put something into place quite rapidly. So we'll get into those items right now. So the first thing that we probably need to talk about is clauses in the contract. So did you face any issues with getting responses back from your vendors that may or may not have been impacted, or maybe talk about what you decided to do first and then go into, was there any contracts language that you needed to look at after the fact or even before?
Absolutely. So you can look at this from several different angles. And one thing to consider is there's a difference between an event and an incident, and not every, just like normal incident response, not every event is an incident. So when we look at having some sort of incident response plan, we want to make sure we have an event management program where we can handle large scale events like SolarWinds or the Exchange incident, or what's the difference between that and a single incident where you learn of something through several ways and have an actual incident with one vendor, and how do you handle that quickly? And is there a different approach to be handled for that? So looking at the contract, of course, is the foundation for everything. And we did notice there's some things that some features of the contract that make it very helpful for a situation like this. And the first piece, and you hear about it a lot in different webinars and shared assessments and everything else, is having that right to audit clause or right to assess clause in the contract, where many times if a vendor, especially if they're an existing vendor, they may not respond to you at all because there's been no precedent set for no reason for responding. They don't need to respond to you. They're already doing business with you. But if you can, when you're onboarding a vendor and actually have a say in the contract that's about to be signed, then you can look for things like make sure you have a right to, I prefer to call it a right to assess clause more so than a right to audit, because many times the right to audit clause may be mistaken to look at either just financial information and financial controls, or the vendor may think it's a one-time deal where you're being thoroughly audited and vetted and scrubbed by the customer, which is not really the case. If you have a right to assess, if you word it properly, that gives you the right to actually ask them anytime if there's an event like SolarWinds or an actual incident, or whenever you think they should be assessed, to have that discussion. And it allows the door to be opened where you can actually then discuss things with the vendor. If you don't have that in place, they have no reason to talk with you, and probably would not want to talk with you unless absolutely necessary, because anything that's said could be held against them legally in their mindset. So having that initial door with the right to assess clause is definitely helpful. And not only that, once you have the right to assess clause, hopefully you have a right to report or remediate clause. And essentially, if you're conducting an assessment and you find some shortcomings or some issues that you would recommend be addressed, you need to have a mechanism for actually reporting back to the vendor and telling them that, and working with them to address those issues, depending on the risk of the vendor, which you don't even know unless you do an assessment up front. So you need to do that assessment. You need the right to be able to do that assessment, and then look to give some remediation answers. And once you have that in place, hopefully you have a security controls addendum, some basic requirements that you want them to be able to meet if they're going to do business with you, especially if they're going to connect to your network. So hopefully that's an addendum in the contract. But having an incident notification procedure in there is big too, because not only do you want to give them an email address they should be able to contact in case they do have an incident, and they understand that they should contact you within a reasonable time frame if they have an incident that affects your data, but not only an email address, but a phone number as well, because we've seen before, if a vendor is hit by a ransomware attack, they may not be able to email you at all, but if they have a phone number, they can call you, and they can call your SOC if you have one, and they need to have somebody to call. And not only do they need to be able to contact us, but we need to have a contact on their side as well. And that should be stipulated in the contract that there is a certain number and email address to call on our side, but we should have a contact on their side. So for individual incidents, that's very helpful. That also comes into play as well. If you have that good email contact, then you can do some batch event management, which is what we did for SolarWinds.
What's interesting also is some of these impacts were fourth parties. So in contracting, would you think that there'd also need to be some fourth party stipulations to be able to know who the fourth and maybe nth parties are? And then the other thing that I was thinking about as you were talking is point of contact accuracy. Do you hold them contractually obligated to provide you point of contacts that have an ebb and flow throughout a life cycle of a career or a tenure?
Absolutely. You definitely need the fourth party mentioned in there. Ideally, you want them to be responsible for their third parties, so your fourth parties. So you want that piece in there. And for the contact information, the accuracy, hopefully you mentioned that. And the best way to test that is with a tabletop exercise. And I'm sure we'll probably get that later, but you can actually verify then both on your side, that your contact is correct, and on their side, if something happens.
Exactly. All right, well, the next thing that we wanted to cover is creating an easy mechanism for vendors to proactively, and that word is very important here, update your organization and who to update during the incident. So as you were going through one of the events or incidents that you had mentioned, what was your protocol to proactively update them on what was happening?
Well, it can be done several ways. I've seen it handled differently at different companies. If you're a big financial institution, you probably have a very huge organization that just does this full time. And well, the bank I worked at actually had this in place where anytime a vulnerability was made known and seen in the wild, they would blast out to all the vendors for the bank, ask them if they had this vulnerability seen in their system, and if so, have they remediated that, or do they have a plan to? And very laborious, and it's a very time consuming. We did something similar for for SolarWinds. We were asked to actually come up with basically a snapshot of how to what extent is our vendor population affected. So we just came up with an automated questionnaire. Actually, well, full disclosure, Prevalent came up with it, and we used it as soon as it came online, and basically asked a set of questions where we could just blast out to all of our third parties that we had in our inventory that we had already been assessing, and just ask them simple questions like, have you been affected by this event? If so, to what extent? What was the impact? Have your critical systems been affected? Has our data or have our operations been affected as a result of what happened on your side? Do you have an incident response plan in place, which hopefully you already know that based on your risk assessment you conducted previously, and ask them if they have mitigating controls in place. And very quickly, as those vendors responded, we could aggregate those answers, and then at a very high level look and see, okay, X percentage says they've been moderately affected, but they have controls in place, or X percentage has no clue how to fix this and they are dead in the water. What do we do? And what we like to do, our approach is really partner with the vendor, almost taking that that welcome to the aisle approach. Just like in the middle of the store, if someone asks for a screwdriver, you don't tell them it's an aisle 10. You walk with them to aisle 10 and show them it's a screwdriver, and also make sure it's the right tool they need for their job. Same thing with the vendors. We're not the bad guys saying you can't do business with us. We want to help them and partner with them and make sure they have robust controls in place so that our relationship and our transactions can be secure. So we partner with them and find out if they are having issues, then we can help show them best practices and what to do, and make some recommendations at a very high level. And then also we have that attestation. If they say nothing's been affected, but we also have a questionnaire saying that we ask them to research their systems and data and make sure that our data is not affected, and that they agree to notify us if it is, and we get their agreement to notify us in the future, then we kind of have that to show we've done our due diligence. We've done basically all we can at that point to verify that they actually are secure from that event. Now, we'll validate that as much as possible. We use a continuous monitoring application as well. There are many out there like Security Scorecard, BitSight, and multiple others. And you can take data from those applications and see which of your vendors have been affected, at least on that side, looking at raw data and seeing you have a potential number of vendors that have been affected. Then we'll follow that up with the questions as well, with the same survey from the Prevalent platform, and tell them we've detected this on our with our security control application or ratings application. Is this indeed true? And do you have systems that are affected, and have you secured them? So we can kind of validate their answers that way too, or find vendors that we never knew about that weren't even in our population, but we detected them through our other tool, and then we can follow up that way.
Yeah, I like how you said that you used a two-prong approach. So you had the threat intelligence, so you could see the outside in impact, and then you validated that or verified it. On the other course, where sometimes people will use the questionnaire first and then use the threat intelligence. So you kind of flip-flopped it, which was awesome.
Right.
And then I think that with our questionnaire that you used, we wanted to make sure it was very easy with the vendors, so that if they weren't impacted, they answered that one question, I'm not impacted, and they were done. It was like a one question questionnaire. So it was dynamic enough to say, if I'm not impacted or I'm not using SolarWinds Orion, leave me alone so I can go do my work. But if I am impacted, then I can tell you the additional 7 to 11 questions. So you can find out what's.
Yeah, having it scalable is definitely very helpful, because one thing we don't want to do doing this consistent event management program is just having burnout and fatigue from answering these surveys all the time, because no one will enjoy that, and it's a pain for everybody. So we don't want to create that and have them answer questions they have no need for answering. So that scalable approach definitely helped us.
And then if you were to think about how often you had to report up the metrics to who did you report them to, and how often did you have to report that?
Well, it kind of goes back to creating value for your third-party program. So if you can have that information in your back pocket, first of all, so that if you're asked, you can immediately produce something that's fantastic, because it's showing you're being proactive and you're thinking outside the box, and your leadership will probably love to know that. But the information can go as high as the board. Many times, at least your CISO will want to know this kind of information, and they may be asked. And if they're caught in the corner and they can't give an answer, then it makes them look bad. So the more we can do to help our leadership look good and be able to present information to the board at short notice, then the better we all look.
Well, I'm very glad that you had an automated capability, because I remember the day when we did not, and we were doing things with Excel spreadsheet and email, and we had to report up to the board on a daily basis where we were, and it was a nightmare. So kudos to you for having some automation.
It sounds very
Right,
stressful.
Amanda, it sounds like we have a question, or it looks like we have a question.
Yes. Curiosity is the basis of this question. They want to know, what was your percentage of non-response from vendors?
That is a good question. So we looked at this two different ways. We had our own percentage, and ours is about 50%. Not everybody will respond to anything, but about 50%. There are other peers are using the same mechanism, and their returns look anywhere from 50 to 60%. So I think the highest we heard of was maybe 60. Brenda, correct me if I'm wrong.
From the larger corporations that we have on peer-to-peer groups, I think you're right. It just depends on what type of a questionnaire. We do have a healthcare industry that's using a ransomware questionnaire, and their percentage is up in the 80-90%. So it really depends on what they're asking, when they're asking it, why. But for rapid response, they're starting to figure out that if I have a dynamic questionnaire to answer, it's no problem going in and saying I'm not impacted, because then they'll get left alone, and it's shared with other customers as well.
Perfect. Oh, it looks like we have another one.
Okay.
Nope, just kidding. I didn't press answered.
Okay.
Bye.
Well, as Amanda is disappearing again for a second until another question is asked, the next thing is how to quantify the business impact. What are the steps that you took, Jefferson, to quantify business impact?
That is, that's a good question, and not easily answered. So the short-term answer is looking at the answers back. I actually pulled everything into a reporting platform and just showed statistically, here are the answers. We know that X percentage are, they had no issue at all. And for the most part, vendors were not really affected by SolarWinds. Now that could be because they honestly weren't affected, or they just didn't think they were affected, and they were. So we want to couple that with what we're seeing through the threat intel platform. So that's the first piece. The second piece, you can take that a step further. And then if you have your vendors in a GRC platform, and you've done some sort of disaster recovery assessment on them as they're brought on board, which larger companies will do that, you can look at their disaster response tiers and figure out, okay, here are the companies, or the most critical vendors that that have the shortest repair time objectives. These are the ones that were affected. These are the most critical. So we need to report these as well, and show the different tiers of vendors that you have, just how many of them have been affected. So we tier our vendors and stratify them based on different factors. So we would want to be able to show how many of each set of stratified vendors, how much are they impacted.
Yeah, and I think that another company that I'm familiar with is they use the responses to identify that they had 15 incidents last year, and now it's creeped up to 51. And then they took the cost of how much it was for their resources to attend to the incident, to manage all of the ramifications and the mitigations, and they came up with a qualified amount that would be per incident. And so they're looking at, as long as we're doing these proactive incident response type scenarios, and or we're doing them ahead of the time with ransomware questionnaire sections or something to that effect, they could save the company potentially, this isn't completely accurate, but potentially $7 million. And that's huge. So that's why it's so important to start looking at your incident management plan within your TPRM, more importantly than what questionnaire am I going to use, because you want to address the things that matter right now that we're addressing from or finding that we're being impacted by. So interesting information, but we'll hope to see that that's truly the case, that they're really finding out that here's some phishing incidents that may occur if we don't bridge that gap, or here's some access identity management items that will occur if we don't bridge that gap. And so really looking and honing in on the most important, maybe 11 to 15 key controls is going to help. So if we talk about targeted questionnaires, and that kind of goes right into what I was saying. So the right questions for the organization. What are you doing at Lowe's to help make sure that we're not causing questionnaire fatigue? Because now if we're having so many incidents or events, and we keep asking them, are you impacted? Are you impacted? Are you impacted? They're going to be struggling to keep up on those, along with the main due diligence stuff that we have to find out. What is your thoughts on approach there?
Right. Well, good question. So the first piece goes back to that, the tiering of the vendors, having some sort of methodology, and there's no one right answer. It depends on the maturity of the organization and how much time you have to develop this, but different tiers will receive different levels of attention, different levels of due diligence. If they are a very low risk vendor, or maybe only deal with public information and have no connections to the network, then you just have maybe a very simple set of 5 or 6 questions, 10 at the most, to ask them some simple questions, and that can count as the assessment. That's it. But as they are higher tier, recognized as higher tier vendors, then you can ask them the full questionnaires from the automated platform, which is what we do based on the inherent risk determined at the very beginning. But we don't want to ask everybody the same thing. It may be that if they're a vital supply chain vendor, they may get additional questions about ransomware, which you mentioned earlier, and make sure they have certain controls in place. And if we want to couple that again with the threat intel, but if there may be just a vendor that only just ships items to somebody, they don't have much except maybe some limited PII, then we don't want to ask them the full range of questions that we would someone who's handling PCI transactions for the business. So we don't want to frustrate the vendors, but at the same time, we'll work with what we can get. So if they're high risk, they get a high number of questions. Low risk, low number of questions.
And then add-ons, I assume, for anything that is instantaneous.
Right.
All right,
Question
Amanda.
for you, Jefferson. Would you do anything different if the third party leverages a cloud platform?
Yes, we do have a subset of questions based on if they are a cloud application, then there are certain things we'll ask additional that if they're not a cloud vendor, they won't get those questions in the dynamic questionnaire that we use. So thankfully we can do that. Previously, if we were just using spreadsheets or the Word docs like we used to do, everyone gets the same questionnaire and they just go through and answer NA to a bunch of questions. And all it does is frustrate the vendor and frustrate the analyst trying to assess the answers as well.
Mm-hmm. So it sounds like you're just catering to everyone in specific types of questions, and that's good.
Trying to, and then making it as automated as possible. So
yeah,
we don't want a person to have to go in there and figure out, okay, let's give them section A, B, and C, but not D. We want the system to do that for us, because the more we automate with the limited number of resources, the more we can do.
Perfect. That's all for now.
And I
keep
like
them coming though, people. Yeah.
yeah. Do keep them coming. And I like how you talked about the NA. If it's going to be NA, they shouldn't be asked that anyways. Right. So hopefully your NA is at a very small percentage to nil. All right. So layers of insight needed before a breach and public disclosure. What do you think about that topic?
Well, it's interesting because we look at it from a couple different ways. We may learn of a breach. First of all, there needs to be that path of being informed, and you really only find that out by doing tabletop exercises internally, even possibly with a third party there in attendance. But knowing what a breach is and what a breach isn't definitely helps, because not every event bubbles up to the level of a breach, as we know, and many times the vendors won't necessarily know they've had we'll call it an incident. If sometimes, like with SolarWinds, we found out a lot of times vendors didn't even know they were using SolarWinds. But if we're using the threat intel platform that says they are, then we send them the questionnaire saying, hey, we understand you may have had an issue with SolarWinds. Can you tell us more about it? Answer these questions. And their response coming back to us would be, well, we don't use SolarWinds. Well, it turns out they actually did, but the person who's answering didn't even know it. So first we'll have to verify the answers and make sure that we're talking with the right people. Make sure we understand what a breach is and what a breach isn't. Ben Wright from SANS and his legal data investigations class talks about how not every event that gets reported really needs to be, simply because not every event is technically a breach. I mean, depending on how your company defines it and your risk appetite, and the laws in your area, the areas where the data is affected, if the data is encrypted, it was never actually extracted, it may not be a breach depending on your situation. And so make sure that before we say that the sky is falling, make sure that we actually do have a breach. And many times what is initially looked at as a breach may not be, but having a vendor also agree to inform you when they have a breach versus when they think they may, but they're not sure, that will get a lot of pushback as well from a vendor, because many times they don't want to tell you ahead of time because it makes them look bad, and they don't want to cause a fire drill. There's no need for one. So understanding and having everybody agree to what actually is a breach, what constitutes a breach, and have everybody be on the same page definitely helps, because when something bad actually happens, a lot of people will probably argue, if you never actually practiced this before and done a tabletop, those are items that need to be addressed beforehand. And public disclosure is great if you have a tool can actually identify those public disclosures, because many times we may learn of an event that a vendor never told us about, simply because they didn't disclose it to their actual customers, but it shows up in the news. And then at that point, okay, now that we've learned about it, we've become aware of it. Now we need to find out if there actually was an issue. So we have to start the whole process then, just because we were informed in a news article that this one shipping company was affected.
Yeah, and I heard something recently that made me chuckle, but it said that third-party risk management was like a company that was dating vendors. And when you're on a date, you want to have the awareness to know, is this a really good relationship that we're going to have? Because this relationship is going to be about honesty and about trust and about forthcoming information. And we're going to have problems and we're going to have to resolve them and all of these things. So it was kind of interesting when I looked at this topic that we were going to discuss, and it was really about building a relationship from the very beginning that helps to foster open communication, so that they don't feel like when they are a victim that they can't tell you what's happening. Because in order to stop the bleeding or to stop a problem from spreading, you would have to be able to know, not wait for a disclosure to come out. And then having a vendor risk management database for those companies that are extremely mature, that they can see all the interconnections of what companies are working with whom, what business units are being provided services by those vendors that you're contracted with, or outsources or supply chains. And then being able to toggle and pinpoint exactly what will happen to your business with resiliency based on the fact that something's going on out in the wild and or impacting you already. So those are some other layers of insight that I would think would be important to see, is just the holistic picture, having the relationship, and my crazy analogy that I adopted from someone else that I heard about dating your vendors. All right, so let's talk about the top 2 takeaway points. So we talked about 5 different things that are important about an incident plan. We didn't really broach the topic of too much about the scenario-based tests. We kind of touched the curve of that. But what 2 takeaway points would you think about, other than what we've talked about right now, that would be important for the listeners to know?
Well, I think the first takeaway point would just be how it all goes back to the contract at the very beginning. If you can have the contract in place, it makes life a lot easier, because then you're not blindsiding the vendor and they're not asking you, why are you even talking to us? They know to expect that anytime there's an issue, because they've already agreed to it beforehand. And you really have leverage at the very beginning of the process during onboarding. When they want your business, they're going to give you their answers for an assessment if you conduct the assessment then. And if you get that buy-in where you have the right to assess, then everyone's good. So you have to have that set up in the very beginning. And not only so the second point is, not only is it good to have an incident response plan for yourself, and that's just common, that's elementary at this point, every company needs to have that, but making sure that your vendors have that as well. And we're supposed to test our incident response plan, and even NIST says now in their cybersecurity framework under the supply chain domain that we need to test our incident response plans with our vendors, but we should also be making sure that our vendors are having an incident response plan in place and testing it as well. And many times they'll find out that they actually haven't tested it, but you won't know that until you do your own testing with them to start with.
Right, those effectiveness controls. So my takeaway would be automating the incident response element and what those tasks are. And so when you have rapid response, there are all of these different things within the wheel that are located on this slide. And automating those critical tasks help to quickly discover and quantify and remediate those risks, and then have reporting that you can take up to your organization. So what Lowe's did was very fabulous in my mind, because they were one of the largest companies that took advantage of what we put in place very quickly. And they said, okay, we're going to use this questionnaire, we're going to send it out. And I think even at the time, you learned about new vendors. So you didn't even know which vendors it had to go to. And all of a sudden they were coming to you with, oh, wait a minute, these are also our important vendors. So can you send it out to them as well? So you also find out about more vendor universe. And so centrally managing that, tracking and scoring, having a prescriptive remediation guidance, reporting on the progress, and being able to either use what Lowe's did was internally, they did everything themselves, but we also have ways of doing it within the network where our managed services takes care of all of it for you and then tells you who's impacted versus you having to do the legwork. So it looks like we have a question, Amanda.
This is kind of a ask for help kind of scenario. How do you assess a third party when they respond to all their information? They respond that all their information is confidential.
That's a good question. So we've run into that as well. And it depends if they're an existing vendor that we just discovered or if going through the onboarding process as well. So again, you have leverage if you're onboarding them and you insist that right to assess clause not be redlined out, you have that in there, then that takes away the ability to say that. However, if they're an existing vendor, well, then you kind of have to be delicate with them. So you can play hardball, but you make sure that they know that you have an NDA in place. Hopefully you have an NDA with them and with the platform you're using. So we have NDAs with Prevalent and with every vendor we work with. So make sure they understand the NDA and put their legal team in touch with your legal team if you need to. Worst case, if they can provide a SOC 2 type 2 report that has the bridge letter and is actually covering the right scope of your engagement, that's a judgment call. Do you accept that or not? We like to make it as easy for the vendor as possible, as long as we're getting the information we need based on the risk of the vendor. So you can't treat everybody with the same lens. You have to adjust it and be willing to work with the vendor. If they insist on not giving information because they say it's confidential, if it push comes to shove, at the end of the day, we make a recommendation to the business unit that we either recommend the engagement, we recommend the engagement with remediation, or we do not recommend. And if they refuse to cooperate with the risk assessment, then we do not recommend them. We can never reject a vendor engagement, but we can tell the VP of that business unit that we recommend against the engagement unless they answer our questions. At that point, the VP has to actually accept the risk. We don't accept the risk for the vendor, but at that point, it's the VP's call for that business unit.
That's interesting. I feel like I'm learning something new every day here. I have one more question. Is there a difference between right to audit and right to assess?
That's an excellent question. So right to audit, many times, depending on who's reading it, vendor may think that right to audit means it's just talking about financial controls, or they may say that right to audit is way too invasive. We're not going to do that. And they may balk at that. Many times, if using the phrase right to assess is softer, it's less confrontational, and it also is, because it's a little bit more vague, it gives you the right, depending on how you define assess, it gives you the right to do a risk assessment as necessary for the security controls, but also to do incident response assessments as necessary based on events that happen in the wild, or supply chain attacks, or things that we can't really predict, but we know more of those will happen. So it's really more of a psychological move than anything, saying the right to assess. We're not looking for their financial controls. We don't care about that necessarily from an information security perspective. Other groups may care about that. We're just wanting to assess the security controls that are relevant to our engagement.
What's interesting, Jefferson, is I've heard this term where it's now changed from just right to assess to right to risk assess. And it puts that other little play in there that says, we're not auditing your company, we are assessing your risk. So
yeah, the specificity. I'm going to go away now. Continue the question.
It's called COVID second shot. Foggy brain.
Yeah, it's a good point. I used to do internal audit, and an audit is not the same as an assessment. And we will not audit a company. Audits are incredibly invasive, time consuming, and you're testing all the controls, and looking for evidence of controls. An assessment really is you're taking their word to a large degree, making sure that basic controls are in place. They're saying they are. So you have their attestation that can be used if there is a breach later on. You want to make sure they're answering honestly up front, just like whenever we answer a question or an assessment for our company, whatever company you work with, you want to make sure you're giving honest answers. Because if you say you have a patch management program in place, but then you get hit with an attack that was made possible because you haven't patched your systems in 2 years, well, there's an issue because you told us that that you do have patch management program in place, and you told us that you do vulnerability management, you do have an incident response program, but then it turns out if you don't, then you lied on your assessment, and that can, depending on how the contract's written, that can have penalties in there.
Food for thought while you're saying this, like at the end of the day, isn't it just helpful for the vendor? Like you're helping each other. It's kind of like a Jerry Maguire situation, like help me help you. You answer these questions, then you're going to know if you're like aligning with whatever you need, or like even if there's like a rapid response scenario where you have a data breach, like don't they want to know if they're at risk? It's just like wild to me. Like when vendors, I guess, would give you the pushback, it's like they kind of would want to know that, right?
It covers the gambit, but a lot of vendors are very appreciative because they're small vendors that don't have full information security shops, or they outsource their IT programs. They're thankful for the information because these are things they have never heard before. Others may push back because they just don't have the program in place, don't want to spend money. So there's that the back and forth you have to have with them.
I think the more mature companies are doing a great job with sharing the information that they're receiving from their threat intelligence reports, and then identifying the risks that are applicable to the company that's contracted for the engagement. So it's been eye-opening for them. I felt the same thing or experienced the same thing when working with vendors. They're like, thank you for all of this. We'll go work on cleaning up our threat intel report.
Right.
We'll make sure we do these risk closures. And if you have any advice, please point us in the right direction, and always point them to frameworks and guidance. Don't tell them what to do. Because if they have a breach, then you're kind of held responsible too. But it's helpful for them.
Yeah. All right. That was my own little thing. Continue.
Okay, so we're going to open it up for more questions, but I just wanted to remind everybody on the phone, for those of you who are new to us, otherwise this is something that you see. We are part of the leadership quadrant in the Gartner scale. And so I want to make sure that you know that Lowe's is listed listed in the trusted, I was putting words together, area, along with some of our other companies that we have as premier customers. We like to be innovative, so we listen to our customers in what they need and make changes to the platform and the services in order to supply these types of things to them. And rapid response was one of those. We found out that every individual needed to find out what was going on with their vendors. And so we put something together as quickly as possible. And then we're one of the fastest growing vendor network type of companies, so that we can make sure that we're repurposing information for other customers. So we'll go into the Q&A section, see if there's any questions that didn't get asked by either myself or through Amanda. And as you have Jefferson here, make sure you take advantage to ask him, things that he's experienced when it comes to incident, event management, or rapid response.
I don't have anything yet right now, but I would encourage the troops in the participants category to ask take advantage of this opportunity to do so. But in the meantime, I will put up another poll question and share that. And let me launch it right now. And we're curious, obviously we wanted to know in the beginning what made you come here, but are you guys looking to augment or establish a third-party risk program in 2021? What do you have going on? Please answer honestly too, because I will be the one reaching out to you. So I don't want you to get surprised when you see something from me, but it is from me or Amy Tweet, who is my counterpart here at Prevalent. But yeah, let us know. We're here to help you, obviously. And if you're curious, Jefferson is a customer of ours, so please take advantage of this now and ask while we have the time. Oh, we have 2 questions. Perfect. All right. First one is, how do you handle an organization who insists on responding to assessment questions out of context? For example, responding with general security controls and not necessarily as they pertain to your relationship with them or the incident being addressed?
That's a good question. So really the initial questionnaire, that sets the tone for the conversation. And if they're very vague or they're not giving the answers we need, then we have a follow-up call with them. And ask to have like a 1-hour call and just get further information about what we're asking and clarify some issues. Or maybe during risk assessment, we may have some questions about some of their answers. So we'll have that call to answer. If they still aren't very cooperative, then we'll call it a virtual documentation review, or a virtual assessment. And we'll do that, basically do like an on-site assessment, not to that extent almost, but almost there. And we'll do it virtually. So, we'll ask for evidence of certain items that we're looking for, and we'll have that virtual conversation. Worst case, then, if they're a very high priority vendor and they're not giving us answers we need for a risk assessment, then we can do an on-site assessment if necessary. But those are very few and far between. We try not to do that for obvious reasons, just because the expense and certainly with COVID this year, that's not something you can easily do.
Mhm.
But so we scale our response based on what they're answering. Again, we can follow up with a simple phone call or more in-depth virtual assessment with our, we have a checklist we use for that, and certain questions that we're looking to get answered for a thorough virtual assessment if necessary.
Is there anyone else that you leverage for that kind of thing? Like, if one person doesn't respond, do you have multiple contacts for a vendor that you just kind of like go up and above, or?
Well, if we aren't getting a good response from the vendor, then we include the business unit, because at the end of the day, they're the ones responsible for accepting the risk. So if it's just an issue of no response, we'll go to the business unit first and tell them, hey, we need a better contact, or we need you to get them to respond to us. Otherwise, we have no choice but to not recommend the vendor.
And how does Prevalent help you with this?
Prevalent helps us with this by, we can track. The nice thing is, any questionnaire we send out, we can track when we send it out. We can track SLAs for, when was it sent out? When was it first answered? Was it totally answered? Was it ever fully completed? Was it completed within the time frame that we set for them? And we can look at our SLA for response or failure to respond rates, and we can track that. We can track for business units or for the enterprise as a whole. So we can kind of see. That helps us to determine also if, is a questionnaire too bulky and cumbersome where people just can't answer it within a certain time frame because it's so nasty and they look at it, they don't want to. Or if we're getting a good response rate, then maybe it's just like Goldilocks and 3 bears. Maybe it's just right, and we know that we're in good shape.
Perfect. All right. Now, one other.
Oh, go ahead. Perspective before, just to add on to that. Lowe's was one of the first companies who was brave enough to go and ask the vendors information gathering questionnaires for profiling. So during COVID, they had received a list of thousands and thousands of vendors that may or may not have had point of contacts. And so what they did was they sent out these questionnaires, and from the bounce backs, correct me if I'm wrong, Jefferson, but you received bounce backs, and those listings went back to your internal organizations to say, okay, the ones that we have information on. This is the bucket of vendors that we don't have accurate point of contacts. So we need either the business to give those to us, or we're going to have to use a new feature that you may not have started using yet, but we have what's called a contact lookup feature. And it gives you information on who you could go ask just to get it to the next person, that someone physically is working there and they can get it to the right area. So if that's accurate, Jefferson, correct me if I'm wrong, but that's one of the techniques that you fed into the feature being developed.
Absolutely. Now, we've not done that last piece that you're referring to with that feature, but yes, we did basically take our entire vendor inventory who we knew we were already doing business with. We had possibly a contact email address, and we sent them an inherent risk questionnaire, really the vendor information gathering questionnaire, and asked them, what are you doing for us? Who's your contact at Lowe's? And what type of data are you working with? And we really use that to scale the inherent risk with the vendor. And then we would automatically rank those into buckets, high, medium, or low. And the high risk vendors would automatically have risk assessments launched through the system, the more in-depth assessment as required. So we actually surprisingly got a good turnaround from that, good response. We had a large number that did not respond that we could then turn over to procurement and the business units and say, hey, give us good information or we can't do our jobs. But the ones that did answer, which were a surprising number of vendors that did respond, we could then automatically fire off assessments, which created less work for analysts because they don't actually see the assessment until they have a completed questionnaire in front of them, and then they can just jump straight into the analysis.
Mm-hmm. Perfect. All right, well, are you guys ready to move on to the next question? Okay, cool. So the next one is, do you risk rank your vendors as critical, high, medium, low, or use other buckets?
We do. We call them, we have different terms, but essentially, yes, it's critical, high, medium, and low, based on, they have, every vendor that comes on board goes through an inherent risk screening first through our intake and our GRC platform. And then if they rate a critical, high, or medium, then they'll get that full assessment through the Prevalent platform. If they're low risk, then basically it stops there, but we file them away in our GRC platform, saying no further assessment required. And manufacturers many times are falling into that category unless they are vital supply chain vendors. Then we treat them as a critical vendor, and also we can do that from the other direction, like Brenda just mentioned with that vendor information gathering survey. If we don't know how they were screened in the beginning because there was no vendor onboarding assessment. Let's say if you have a new program and you have thousands of vendors already in play that were never screened, then you can do it the other way and actually ask them through that survey, ask them what they do, and then automatically rank them that way. And when we do that, we have high, medium, and low buckets as well.
Perfect. Well, that is all we have for right now. I encourage anyone else, even any other customers that are on the line right now, if you guys wanted to, oh, we got another one. I love pushing it. All right. Thanks, people. Okay. Oh, this is a hefty one. Now that Privacy Shield is invalidated and vendors who are transferring personal data from the EEA to the US, or personal data is being accessed from US that is stored in the EEA, how are you obtaining vendors' responses on the safeguards used to allow the transfer and/or access of the EU personal data?
That's a good question. Thankfully for us, that's a very limited set because all our business is done in the US. Mm-hmm. And so we don't really have that to the same play, but it's another good reason to actually partner with your legal team as well, because we do privacy impact assessments automatically on our side with legal's involvement as well, which is an automated assessment in the GRC platform. So we're able to track the personal information that way. But as far as EU transfer of information, that's something we're just now taking a look at.
And some of the mature companies I've seen, they just make sure that the information is stored in the appropriate areas with their software as a service, if that's the case. And then resources in those locations can do the assessments and make sure that it doesn't cross the border as it shouldn't, or be viewable as it shouldn't. There's also some stipulations in the legal, like you said, Jefferson, that if there is the ability to cross, then those items are very well in tune with the legal ramifications and or the protections.
That makes sense. All right, we have a couple more here. Thanks everyone for participating. How many vendors do you assess per year, and how many team members are doing this work for you, Jefferson?
Well, the actual number of vendors, I'd say, is in the thousands. So we do have a very large number of vendors. We do automate the process as much as possible. We have a team of more than a dozen analysts that do this work. And ideally, getting that ideal number of how many assessments should any one analyst have at any given time, it varies. The old school answer is about maybe about 15 a month is what analysts can complete. The more you automate, the more you can bump that up. So we're trying to push the envelope and see how many we can do, but at the same time, not degrade the quality of the assessment. We don't want to just punch a ticket and say that the assessment was done. So there's that fine balance between doing as many as possible per analyst, but at the same time still creating value and actually having relevant findings that are remediated. So we'll also break it down in different teams. And as we grow, we have the assessment team, but we have a remediation team, and then the event management team as well. Right now, everybody does all the work, but as we grow and mature, we want to have different little mini teams that will handle different pieces of the vendor life cycle.
A lot of companies will identify in their policy that they're only working on a certain volume of assessments based on their criticality. So they'll work on the criticals and the highs first, and then the following year they'll continue to work on criticals and highs, but they'll add the mediums. So that's another approach that people will take based on how many resources they have.
Yeah, I mean, probably important to even realize, like, if you were looking for a solution like this and you're here and you don't have anything, you don't have to start massively, right?
Well, and it
Like,
doesn't mean don't do anything for those
Yeah.
other ones. So I know that Jefferson has like threat intelligence and other things in place, or mini questionnaires, or those kinds of things that are key control focused. But when you do the deep dives, you have to really make sure that you're using your resources appropriately based on how many you have on both sides.
Right. Well, to bounce off of this other question, they're curious as to what GRC solution you have that's integrated with your VRM tool, or is it integrated with your VRM tool?
It is not integrated yet, but that's one of our big efforts this year, because again, the more we can automate, the better. So right now, requests come into our GRC platform, and then we manually transcribe that really into our VRM platform. But there is a major initiative underway to automate that and build the connections and the APIs so that once the request comes into the GRC platform, it will automatically flow through. If it needs a full risk assessment, it will automatically launch in the platform, send the assessment to the vendor. They will fill it out in the portal, and then our analysts again won't actually see the assessment. The first time they see it is they have a completed set of questions in front of them.
Perfect. Well, that is it for now. I'm going to say going once, going twice. Anybody else on the line? Any other questions you want to ask Jefferson or Brenda before we give you a couple of minutes back in your day?
Well, thank you, Jefferson.
No.
If no one asks any other questions, I really, number one came in. So that's either a thank you or a great job.
It is two thank yous, many thanks. And thank you guys for coming in and being a part of it. We really do appreciate it. Well, I keep getting thank yous. You're welcome, everyone. Oh, that's so funny. Oh, that's awesome. We love your feedback. We really appreciate everyone joining. And if you guys have any more questions, right on the screen you see here, info@prevalent.net. We will for sure get back to you if you didn't have a chance to ask right away. If you wanted to discuss anything else with anyone else on the line here, we're happy to do so. Again, we will reach out if you said certain answers to the poll questions. So be aware of that. And we're always here to help you guys from a third-party risk management standpoint. But you guys all have 8 minutes left in your day. That is given back to you. Congratulations. I will let everyone go. Yeah, Jefferson, great to see you. Thanks for coming back and joining us. And thanks. Brenda, always a pleasure to see your beautiful face.
Thanks, Amanda.
Wait till next time. Bye, everyone. Thank you.
Bye-bye.